Hello, welcome to this week's edition of Washington Talk. I'm Connie Kim. President Trump had nominated Alex Wong, the State Department's Deputy Special Representative for North Korea, to a post at the United Nations. This comes as a number of U.S. officials dealing with North Korea, including Representative Stephen Biegun, had been promoted or moved to different posts. The White House says another U.S.-North Korea summit is possible, but only on conditions of a good deal. Is the U.S. showing flexibility on North Korea, or is it putting it on a back burner?
President Trump has made it very clear that if he can get a great deal for the American people, he'll go to a summit.
In the studio with me is Mr. Abraham Denmark, Director of the Asia Program at the 윌슨센터. Mr. Denmark previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia in the Obama administration. Also joining me is Scott Snyder, Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of the Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of Seoul's foreign policy and strategic choices. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Denmark, I want to start off with you. So we've seen a series of personnel changes within the State Department. So what does this indicate on the U.S.-North Korea talks?
I think there's two things going on. One is there's a natural and very common evolution of who has what job within the U.S. government. People change jobs every few years in the U.S. government, and so there's a very natural change every once in a while. But we have seen people who work on North Korea issues change out fairly rapidly across several different people that were mentioned before. And I think it shows to me that there's a reduced expectation for diplomatic progress with North Korea. So they're taking very talented, very good diplomats and moving where they be more effective.
Yeah, that's right. On the North Korean side, there's not a demand signal for negotiations. And it actually reminds me of the time period in 2008, 2009, at the beginning of the Obama administration, when the North Koreans made it clear that they were not coming to negotiations. They were pursuing a route that included nuclear and missile testing. And as a result, at the beginning of the Obama administration, Stephen Bosworth was appointed as a special representative, but only in a part-time capacity. And in some respects, I think that is very similar to the situation right now. No demand. Steve Biegun remains in charge, but he has a lot of other responsibilities. The difference is that he is within the State Department. And if necessary, I think that he could rapidly call on resources to reconstitute a team that would enable the U.S. to engage with North Korea, but only in the event that they have something to do.
Mm-hmm. So the U.S. clearly says that they're ready to have another summit with Chairman Kim, but they would have to make sure that there is a good deal. So on the surface, while there are some personnel changes, is the U.S. administration trying to monitor and maintain the status quo in North Korea?
Well, it strikes me that the administration is still keeping an eye on North Korea. We still have USFK, we still have diplomats engaging on these issues. But it does strike me that President Trump seems to want this issue to be fairly quiet and calm over the next several months. I expect primarily because of his domestic political needs. But just because the president would rather see things calm, I think we shouldn't confuse that for nothing changing. Nor should we confuse it for the United States not paying attention to what's happening with North Korea and not keeping an eye on what North Korea may be up to.
Mm-hmm. But with this kind of an approach that we see on the surface, wouldn't it be hard to keep North Korea's nuclear weapons development in check?
Well, I don't really see North Korea's weapons program as in check. North Korea has continued to test shorter range missiles, and there is nothing stopping them from continuing to build nuclear weapons. So while things are quiet on the surface, I wouldn't mistake that for nothing happening. I think there's still quite a lot happening below the surface, but at least at the political level, things seem to be rather calm right now.
Mm-hmm. Looking at the surface underneath, then which side has it more favorable right now in this current situation?
Well, I think that as long as North Korea can pursue its program unhindered, they may feel that they have an advantage. And in fact, with nothing going on, over time, the U.S. is going to find itself in a more difficult position, as we have seen with North Korea's nuclear development now over decades. But the real question, I think, is related to whether or not the U.S. can continue to put pressure on North Korea in the form of sanctions.
Mm-hmm. There's one other factor that we don't know a lot about that could be pushing things in a direction that we may not expect, which is domestic politics inside North Korea. We don't know how much pressure Kim Jong-un may be under in terms of pressure to do something against the Americans, to do something against South Korea. We don't know what his domestic political calculations are. It does seem that if President Trump wants things to be quiet, that could represent an area of leverage for Kim Jong-un to make things loud, to make things turbulent, and use that to try to get something out of the United States. But it's very unclear what Kim Jong-un's political calculations may be, and that may affect how things proceed for the next few months.
Mm-hmm.
And if North Korea gets desperate, I think Kim Jong-un has two choices. One is to provoke, but the other might be to grab onto something as a moment of opportunity to change direction. And actually, the coronavirus right now does provide this kind of moment of opportunity. The U.S. government has remained in an engaged mode, including on that issue. And it actually provides Kim Jong-un with a pretext for changing direction without giving the impression that he is doing it out of a sense of vulnerability.
Right. So we haven't seen Kim Jong-un in the public eye for about a month now. And right now, as Scott mentioned, the State Department has offered that they're going to approve humanitarian aid to North Korea in terms of supporting fighting the coronavirus. So do you think this State Department's decision will kind of play into a pretext of North Korea changing its decision?
I think it may provoke a bit of a tactical shift in how North Korea is behaving. If it's desperate for international aid, it may encourage Kim to be rather quiet for a little while. But in terms of changing the broader swath of North Korean strategic direction, in terms of its embrace of nuclear weapons, in terms of its embrace of its current political system, I don't really see a change in U.S. aid policy having much of an effect on that.
Mm-hmm. Scott, you also mentioned the sanctions front earlier, and the State Department says it's going to maintain sanctions on North Korea. And the Trump administration has been putting a lot of emphasis on halting illicit ship-to-ship transfers. So what do you think the U.S. can do more here? Is there room to do more here?
Well, first of all, I think that what the U.S. is doing has been shown to be inadequate. If we look at the panel of experts reporting, we know that the ship-to-ship transfers has gone on. Now we realize that actually the ban on coal exports is being made meaningless as a result of activity between North Korea and China. And so we have to recognize that there are ways that the sanctions regime could be ramped up. And the main area that I think that has gotten a lot of attention on Capitol Hill is related to secondary sanctions, the issue of basically punishing customers of North Korea or partners of North Korea. And in an election year, I think that it's actually harder to imagine that the U.S. is going to pursue that. I'm sure the U.S. Treasury is ready to some degree, but it requires a lot of effort and a lot of momentum from a team within Treasury to be able to do that effectively.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Denmark, if you have anything more to add on whether the U.S. has more room for maritime sanctions enforcement?
There's certainly more that the U.S. could be doing. To me, that it's less a question of what the United States could be doing and more a question of the political question of what does the United States believe that's in its interest. And if President Trump's primary objective is to keep things calm and quiet, then not escalating, not intensifying any sort of maritime interdiction is in line with that policy.
So you just mentioned maritime interdiction. So is this possible in this current sanctions regime? Wouldn't it have any concerns going against international law?
I think I'm not an international lawyer, but my concerns would be less legal and more political and strategic. That if the United States were to start doing that sort of thing, I would expect a North Korean reaction and another round of intensifying tensions. So the legal question aside, I think there's very important strategic questions that would need to be addressed as well.
Mm-hmm. And I also want to take a look at the U.S.-led coalition that was formed to halt illicit ship-to-ship transfers. So that coalition mainly focused on detection and surveillance. Mm-hmm. Then in the international community, do you think that the countries can do more? And do you think, will they do more?
I think they could do more. In terms of would they do more, I think it would depend on their decision about what would be in their interest to do more. The reporting that's been coming out about concerns about North Korean illicit trade practices certainly is concerning. But I think these coalition partners would have the same questions that I would, which is what would be the follow-on effects of doing more? How do we think about potential North Korean reactions, and how does that affect our calculus?
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of this revolves around where you're talking about, because I think the UN Security Council resolutions authorize member states to enforce sanctions within their territorial waters. It gets a lot grayer in terms of exclusive economic zones. But we know some of this activity is occurring within the territorial waters of a member state, and yet we see that member states are not fully enforcing the sanctions. And so that's where I think the greatest opportunity lies, but it's also where the highest barrier exists to actually pursuing sanctions enforcement.
Mm-hmm. And another aspect of sanctions is financial sanctions, and we've heard this week that the U.S. Treasury is going to continue to apply financial sanctions on North Korea. So you briefly mentioned secondary sanctions. So help us understand what kind of effective secondary sanctions there can be in terms of North Korea.
It does require a lot of intelligence gathering and putting together pieces of the puzzle in order to properly identify and make a case for applying sanctions designations to certain North Korean partners. And the North Koreans are very good at sanctions evasion and basically finding new ways of getting what they want. But that's the area that we're talking about if you're talking about the next step in terms of applying sanctions. I think the Treasury has certain capabilities. They're not always willing to use it. Congress seems to suggest that they want to provide some backbone to that effort by Treasury.
Mm-hmm. So there have been calls on secondary sanctions on Chinese firms and banks, but it's been quite difficult because of some political issues. So help us understand why this is so difficult, and do you think the U.S. will go ahead with such a measure?
When secondary sanctions start to impact on Chinese finance, Chinese corporations, and that brings it into a much different geopolitical context, in that the U.S.-China relationship is one of the most consequential relationships in the world. And so it comes down to a question for the U.S. government about prioritization. The Chinese economy is very important for the U.S. economy, even in the midst of the U.S.-China trade war. The Chinese economy is still very important to us. And so the question for the U.S. government becomes, do we want to pursue secondary sanctions vis-a-vis North Korea to the point where it could damage the broader political and economic relationship with China? And that's been what the wall that these questions have been bumping up to so far. Certainly it's possible that the United States could decide that it's high enough a priority to do that, especially within the midst of a broader competitive dynamic between Washington and Beijing. But so far it seems that that's been a line that for the most part, folks haven't been willing to cross.
Then how effective do you think the sanctions regime on North Korea will be this year at a time of deadlock?
Well, I think it's effective in that it's keeping the North Korean economy largely divorced from the rest of the international economy, and that in the ways that it does engage with outside economic actors, especially China, it has to do so mostly covertly. So I think it is somewhat effective in that ways, but in terms of the broader political objective of sanctions, in terms of forcing North Korea to give up on its nuclear weapons and make a different political choice, I don't think that we're any closer today than we were 2 or 3 years ago.
I think it's right that sanctions impose a ceiling on North Korea's growth potential. And it makes it more difficult for North Korea to get some of the things they want in order to pursue some of the things that they shouldn't be doing. But sanctions clearly haven't forced the existential choice that we have wanted Kim Jong-un to make between economic growth and holding on to a nuclear capability.
All right, we'll leave it here for now and move on to our next segment. Let's now watch the video for our next topic.
평양 원수님의 비범한 용도 밑에 개발 완성된 조체 무기들.
China, Russia, North Korea, Iran have or are pursuing WMD capabilities that could threaten the United States.
Leaked UN panel of experts report points out that North Korea continues to enhance its illicit nuclear and ballistic missile programs, including its development of a submarine that could carry ballistic missiles. Senior defense officials have also expressed concern of North Korea's weapons of mass destruction proliferation. We discuss how far North Korea's nuclear weapons threat has come. So, Mr. Denmark, when we talk about submarine-launched ballistic missiles, there are concerns that this may be more worrying than ICBMs. What's the concern here?
Well, generally speaking, submarine-based ballistic missiles are seen as more survivable than other forms, in that submarines are harder to detect, harder to prevent and stop those sorts of missiles from being launched, generally speaking. There's, of course, a lot of questions about North Korea's program. We haven't seen a lot of indications that they've gotten very far. These capabilities are very complicated, very expensive, and we haven't seen North Korea take a lot of successful steps in that direction. But the fact that they're interested in submarine deterrent shows to me that they remain committed to nuclear weapons.
Scott, so how concerning is North Korea's SLBM development to the U.S.?
Well, it's concerning as an expression of intent. And if they were to develop that capability, it would make the issue of responding to North Korea's capability much more complicated. But at this point, I think that the most concerning factor is that it tells us where North Korea aspires to go. And we see North Korea's aspirations as headed in the wrong direction.
Mm-hmm. So, Mr. Denmark, what are some of the aspects that North Korea has to complete in order to make this development of its SLBM complete?
Well, there's a lot of different elements that go into it. First is the missile itself. We've seen North Korea make significant strides in developing an ICBM, but a missile that's launched from a submarine is exponentially more complicated and difficult to accomplish. And then there's the submarine itself, both in terms of designing, building, training, having crews ready, learning how to use submarines. All this is very complicated. It take for countries that do operate these sorts of submarines, it's taken years upon years of development, really decades of development. And so I don't think that it's going to happen anytime soon, but as Scott said, it's a very concerning development in terms of what it signals about North Korea's intents.
Mm-hmm. So they would definitely have to have a submarine large enough to travel longer ranges. So how far have they come in terms of that development?
I haven't seen any reports about any progress in terms of developing an actual submarine. As Scott was saying, it looks like when they do test these missiles, it's from some sort of underwater platform and not actually a submarine. So it seems to me that they still have quite a long ways to go.
So, Scott, we've seen a lot of senior defense officials raising concerns of WMD proliferation from North Korea. So why is this proliferation factor such a concern to the U.S.?
We know that North Korea is a country that has historically seemed to have the motto of being willing to sell whatever to the highest bidder. So it's natural that there would be a concern. We haven't seen this realized yet, but there's natural there would be a concern, especially that a North Korea under sanctions pressure and possibly in need of cash would be willing to sell off parts of their program to willing buyers.
Mm-hmm. Then, Mr. Denmark, how important is it that we need information to these WMD sites?
Well, it's important to understand the breadth of North Korea's WMD program. If we're going to have a successful process towards denuclearization, it requires an understanding of what North Korea's capabilities are, what its infrastructure is, what its weapon systems look like, so that we know what we're getting rid of. So it's an important step in a denuclearization process, as well as to understand what we need to do in order to defend ourselves and defend our allies.
Mm-hmm. And we've recently seen released pictures where U.S. and South Korean military have been holding drills to counter North Korea's WMD threats. So what is the intent behind this, of releasing such photos?
Well, countries pursue WMD capabilities in order to overcome more symmetric challenges, and that if they don't believe that they can fight and win in a conflict soldier on soldier, then they pursue capabilities that give them some sort of an advantage, like WMDs. So it makes perfect sense to me that the United States and our ROK allies would want to make sure that we're able to respond to and operate in an environment in which the North Koreans could use those sorts of capabilities. And in terms of why they would make such an exercise public, again, I think it's in order to, the reason I would do something like that would be to reassure primarily the ROK people that we understand that this is a challenge, and we're making sure that we can deal with that as well as the other challenges that come up.
Mm-hmm. What kind of a message do you think this will be sending to North Korea at this time?
Well, I think the intended message to North Korea is to send the message that it raises the costs in terms of what North Korea would have to achieve in order to be able to attain a victory on the battlefield. And essentially to try to remove from North Korea's realm of thinking the idea that an asymmetric approach could be successful against an adversary like the U.S. and ROK together.
So do these drills actually include eliminating key North Korean personnel?
Well, you know, there have been reports about some past U.S. ROK exercises related to that. But when we're talking about WMD as a focus of exercises, I would think that it's really a matter of defense, not a matter of offense, because you're talking about dealing with an environment in which WMD have been used and figuring out how to be able to continue a fight, in an environment of contamination. And so I think that has really been, the main challenge that is introduced from a warfighting perspective by North Korea's WMD capability.
I would say that exercises between the U.S. and the ROK are stabilizing. They're not made to threaten the North Koreans. They're rather intended to make sure that we're able to sustain stability on the Korean Peninsula, both in terms of reassuring our allies about our capability, but also in terms of telling the North Koreans that any sort of military adventurism that they may consider will fail.
All right, we'll leave it here for now and move on to our next section. Now, time for the photo moment. Time to look at an interesting North Korea photo of the week. This week, we have a photo of Tae Young-ho, a former North Korean diplomat, announcing he will join South Korea's main opposition party and run in April parliamentary elections. He vowed to work on making plans toward implementing a realistic unification policy that Koreans can agree on. If he is elected, it will make him the second North Korean defector to win a seat in South Korea's National Assembly. Scott, what do you make of this?
Well, it's very interesting to think that Tae Young-ho's pathway as a South Korean citizen runs through the National Assembly. And it actually generates it puts the discussion of potential future unification in a different light, I think. In a way, it's an experiment with that. But it's also obviously a development that is very distasteful from a North Korean perspective.
Yeah, I think it says a very strong message about the strength of the ROK's democracy and that North Korean defectors, people from North Korea, are able to succeed and thrive in the South Korean society. So I think politics aside, it's a very positive message.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. That does it for today's Washington Talk, and from all of us here at Voice of America, thank you for watching. This has been Connie Kim.